everyone, as a reminder, we are going to record this session, so if you prefer not appearing the video, please turn off your camera. I think we can already start. Hello, everyone. Thank you to attend to today's book presentation. The presentation is going to start with our authors here present, Scott, Melissa, and Nceba, are going to present their book, and then we'll give some time for questions, comments, and start with the conversation. Well, as I was saying, welcome to today's book presentation about the book Differences at Work, Practicing Critical Diversity Literacy. This book is a practical and easily accessible guide to building critical diversity literacy in modern organizations, grounded in its social science and thousands of hours of industry experience. Today, we have here the authors, Melissa Steyn, who is South African researcher in critical diversity studies and founding director of the Wits Center for Diversity Studies at the University of Witwatersrand. She's best known for her work on witness in post-apartheid South Africa and the development of the critical diversity literacy framework. Scott Burnett is a senior lecturer in communication at the University of Gothenburg. His research, which has focused on race and gender as spatial relations in environmentalist discourse, reactionary white masculinity on social media, and critical approaches to diversity in organizational contexts, has been published in leading academic journals. And Ndzwayiba is Group Director for Human Resources and Transformation at Netcare, and as Associated Researcher at the Wits Center for Diversity Studies. He's passionate about social justice and equality, and his research focuses on the relationship between society and organizations in the reproduction of power, inequality, and marginality. It's a pleasure to have you today with us and be able to learn a bit more about your work. If you are ready, you can start if you want.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Patricia. Thank you for organizing this this meeting and for giving us the opportunity to present. So this is our book. It's been out now for just over a year, and we've got quite a lot of interest in it, which has been fantastic, and we're really looking forward to discussing it with you here today. We are going to be firstly giving you a brief introduction to ourselves. Patricia has already done a lot of that groundwork, so we won't have too much to say. We'll introduce the contributors. Then we'll talk a bit about what critical diversity literacy is, before we give a brief synopsis of what you can find in the book, what topics we cover in each of the chapters, before making some closing comments and hopefully leaving plenty of time for questions and answers. So we are planning to talk for about maybe 30 minutes, maybe 25. We'll try to keep it short, and then to leave the rest of the time to have a conversation with you about what we're doing. So Patricia's already introduced me. My name is Scott, and I work here at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, lecturing mostly in digital communication and working on issues of race, gender, and sexuality from a critical discourse analytical perspective. But let me hand over now to my co-authors. First to you, Melissa. Melissa, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so I'm Melissa Steyn, and I am the director of the Wits Center for Diversity Studies here at Wits University in Johannesburg. And I also hold the research chair in critical diversity studies, as Patricia said, already mentioned. Yes, and I think my passion in life is developing this field of critical diversity studies as an intellectual field, as well as a field of practice. So I'm sure I'll get a chance to sort of talk a little bit more about that too.
Over to you, Nceba.
Thank you, Scott. I'm Ndzwayiba. I am the Group Human Resources and Transformation Director for the Netcare Group, which is now a fully South African-based private healthcare company. And I am associated with the Wits Center for Diversity Studies because I'm very passionate about issues of inequality and issues of social justice. And I locate my work within the intersections of work, society, and what I call the politics of being human.
Great stuff. Thank you so much. We, in order to put this book together, also relied on an excellent set of contributors who we interviewed and to find out what exactly their practice was in everyday work in the field of critical diversity literacy. All of these contributors have their own unique approaches, and what we wanted to do in interviewing them and in including their insights into the book was to make sure that we were bringing a diverse set of practices in conversation with the social science-based practice that we were theorizing and developing in the Wits Center for Diversity Studies. So the people you see here, Pierre Burwood is himself an academic who works at the University of Pretoria and has been a leading figure in fights for sexual justice. Busi Dlamini is an Atlantic Fellow, a young leader who is going to be doing a lot of diversity work with us in the future. Kirsten Klopper is a consultant who works with many large corporations in South Africa. Melanie Judge is another leader and academic, so an activist and an academic in the fields of sexual violence, LGBTQ rights in South Africa, and in changing the conditions of possibility for thriving for queer people in South Africa. Jenny Tsekwa is also a consultant, and she runs her own small consultancy out of Cape Town. And Hayley McEwen is a fellow researcher who's also been a leading figure in implementing critical diversity workshops with us, with some of South Africa's largest corporations. So all 6 of these people have extensive field experience with what it really means to work with a group of people who might be resistant to engaging in a conversation about inequality, about social change, and about what to do with it within an organization. So we wanted to be very certain that as 3 academics, we were not merely talking about, what would be nice in a perfect world, but that we were really engaging with what is possible in the context of companies. And of course, Nceba, being somebody who works every day in the context of a company, is also, of course, someone who brings that richness to the book. Maybe Melissa and me slightly less, but absolutely, it's not really only about just academics or just practice, but about bringing those 2 things together. So let's now start talking a little bit about what we mean by the kind of academic theoretical side. Over to you, Melissa.
Thanks, Scott. I just want to say one thing as a little bit of an advertisement for our center. We very much see ourselves as being at that interface between academia and the real world, as people call it. So, we offer postgraduate education in this field, critical diversity studies. Our mission is to make a real difference and develop cohorts of students who can address these issues, as well as also practicing within our societies. So part of what we have developed, or one of the main and probably the most important output that has come from the work that we've done at the center, which first started at the University of Cape Town in 2000. So we've been around for quite a while, although we're in a different incarnation now at Wits, is this concept of critical diversity literacy. And if I could also just quickly say, Scott, that, recently I was asked to reflect on how this actually emerged for me, the need for such a framework. And, it was integrally connected to the moment in South Africa's history when we were transitioning from apartheid into this new democratic dispensation. And the question that I had been grappling with in other formats and in other work had been about, how do we start a society? Obviously, you don't have a clean slate, but it was pretty much as close to that as one can get in something as complex as a social nation state. But how do we start with different assumptions? How do we think about how we need to be relating to each other if we are to move away from the hierarchical and oppressive systems that have characterized so much of our world towards a society that works with very different assumptions around human dignity, human equality, human freedom. And I like to use the analogy of the way in which we all understand, well, we all should understand, if I can be somewhat prescriptive, the importance of the environment and of the challenges that are facing us, and that our survival is linked to being able to provide things like clean air and clean water to our societies and for our global survival. And I actually believe that the capacity to work with difference in this world that is increasingly interconnected and increasingly stressed because of the other challenges that we face is also one of the essentials that we will ignore at our peril. And I think that it is part of the blind spots that we have, that the social aspects of how do we live together in the world that is emerging is often completely overlooked as one of the major challenges of our times. And I think, it's right up there along with those. And I'll be very happy to say more about that in the question time if you want me to. So why do we call it critical and why do we call it literacy? Critical because we try to make the normative assumptions that hold our societies together according to the current status quo that has been inherited through the modern colonial period. We try to make those visible. The normative order likes to keep those kinds of assumptions invisible, so that we don't think about them, we don't challenge them, and most of the time that we would reproduce them without any thought or reflection or awareness. And what we are doing is aligning ourselves with that school of knowledge construction that says we need to become aware of these assumptions and of the kinds of contradictions that are created within society in order to benefit some and disadvantage others. And literacy, I used this word very deliberately because it's not something that we just simply are born with. It's something that we actually have to be inskilled into in order to be able to read society and read the kinds of social dynamics that operate in any kind of context, whether it's at a very local level, even just like a family, or whether it's a global level. This is a capacitation, and this is what we see critical diversity as a process of capacitation. I also just would like to mention that it identifies key learning areas, 10 key learning areas, 10 criteria that we think would characterize people who are equipped to be able to engage with the challenges of diversity. both at a personal level and at a more systemic level, but also for people, who want to work with these issues quite deliberately, but actually it should be the kind of capacitation that is completely normative, just like we're understanding that people need to be media literate or computer literate or financially literate or any other of these multiliteracies that we now talk about. So these key learning areas of what we need to be have been distilled from current social theory. All right. And I'm going to speak to them really quickly. So I've mentioned 10 criteria that would characterize this capacitation. The first, the foremost, and the fundamental one that actually informs everything is to understand that all of these issues around diversity are grounded in power relations. They're not about biology. They're about hierarchical power relations. So, there's no inevitable reason that comes out of nature why we should regard skin color as a difference, that we should mobilize resources around and create hierarchies of human worth. That's completely the result of social construction within relations of unequal power relations. So we construct the differences that end up making a difference. And that really lies right at the heart of it. So social construction, crucially important. And, unless we understand that we are working with constructions that are socially constructed, that are the outcomes of power differences, and that can be shifted in the same ways as they have been put in place through social construction, through other ways in which we construct knowledge and other processes. Unless we understand that, there's no point in ever actually doing any work around these issues. So there's always a critical hope that is grounded in the belief that social construction opens up possibilities for change. The second point is that social location matters. We have found in our own work that this often is one of the most difficult things to work with and to get people to engage with without becoming defensive. But because these are systems of advantage and disadvantage, we get born into these locations or socialized into them. Obviously, there's some variations in how this happens, but generally speaking, these are about positionalities, social positionalities in relation to each other. So, I can say to you, as people have said to me in workshops, why must people see me as white? Well, sort of tough. They are going to see you as white because, if you are socialized into that space and you receive the benefits of being white, you will be understood that is your positionality. It's how you will be understood within society. And these social locations, very importantly, create certain subjectivity, certain ways of understanding yourself, certain ways of performing yourself, certain ways of obviously understanding the world that include, certain awarenesses, certain blindnesses. And so all of these locations really matter. And we do have to, when we're working around these issues, we have to talk about how we are positioned and understand what comes with positioning. Then these very important points about how social structures overlap and intersect. We talk a lot about intersectionality these days. But to understand that not one of these structures works on its own. We've inherited through modernity systems of white supremacy, systems of patriarchy, systems of heteropatriarchy, systems of ableism. We can go on, and all of these work together in certain ways. they intersect, and we have to understand how are those interfaces constructed, and how do they operate, and how do we also then think of these as things that can be reframed, and the society can be reordered. It's important for us to understand that oppression is not something of the past. It's something that people who are beneficiaries of oppressive systems are very keen to tell us, that things like patriarchy is finished, it's gone. A woman can get wherever she wants to be, and I'm talking just about men and women here. But I've got a mug that says I'll be post-feminist in the post-patriarchy, because in reality we are so far away from having achieved gender equity, and I'm just talking about gender as an example. In fact, if you look at the position of women globally, it's going to be like something like 150 years if we continue moving at the same pace as we are now, before we'd have anything remotely like gender parity globally. So patriarchy is absolutely not gone. Neither is white supremacy or any of these other structural relations that have shaped our modern world. Important that we understand that social identities are learned. In other words, we can't just simply read somebody's identity off a geographical location, for example. We have to understand that we go through social processes that shape who we are, that shape our understandings of ourselves. And that, indeed, these, as I've said a couple of times now, are things that we can have a stance towards. We develop a certain sense of ourselves through social processes. That doesn't mean we're trapped in them. We can identify or disidentify to the extent that we make ourselves conscious and choose to in relation to these social structures. We have a language that we need, or languaging that we need for talking about diversity. In South Africa, for example, we have a distinction that we draw between non-racialism and anti-racism and colorblindness. So what exactly do we mean by these terms? And certainly I have found in teaching students that this is one of the most empowering things that happens for students, is as they discover that they can name things and that they can identify what happens in certain contexts and in their own lives. This is very, very, very empowering. But unless we actually get to be quite precise around what we're talking about, we can't actually name the power relations. We can't actually make them visible and become conscious about them. Decoding oppression is quite important because, as we all know, power doesn't name itself. People in powerful positions in society don't say, you can't marry my daughter because you're black. We don't actually talk like that. We've all learned not to. So, I may say, well, you can't marry my daughter because she's got to go to Europe for a year to complete her education. So there are all these ways in which oppressive structures hide themselves, and they speak in ways that are sort of that circumvent and obscure the actual power relation and the actual dynamics that are happening. So we have to be able to see through that languaging. The material matters. This matters at all sorts of levels. We can't, when we talk construction, we talk about discourse, people often think that we're only talking about language and words and symbols. Not at all. In all sorts of ways, we can show how the social construction absolutely integrally connected to the material world. So we can never, for example, stop thinking about how does class intersect with some of these other identities? How does being middle class and Black in South Africa differ from being working class or being, really poverty stricken? And being Black, and there's of course the world of difference. So material things, and again I can say more because all of this is hugely complex, and we spend years unpacking this with our students. So we're trying to just give you really a very quick taste of what is in critical diversity literacy. But we have to take the material very seriously. A point that I think is so hugely overlooked and under-theorized is how emotions are actually tied up in the construction of difference, in the construction of differences that matter, and in the construction of hierarchies through legitimizing or challenging the inequalities and the unfairnesses that are built into our society along lines of difference. So we just like with everything else, this is all about social learning, and we are taught, we learn, we should respect, we should disregard, who we should hold in contempt, who we should have empathy for, and etc. So the actual boundaries between groups are very largely constructed through the flow of emotions in our society. So we have to understand emotions as actually being work that society does. And importantly, just as much for challenging unfairness and inequality as it is for trying to normalize and naturalize unfairness. And then, if you like, this last one is, if the others are all about reading social relations, this last one is about writing them. So this is the writing part of the diversity literacy, and it's about, how do we actually engage with the world ourselves? How do we either tend to work to reinforce current inequities, current unfairnesses in society? How do we ourselves help to keep them invisible and reproduce them? Or how do we ourselves position ourselves within the various contexts in which we find ourselves as we go through our lives, to try to work towards a fairer, more just society, and one in which the oppressive structures that we have inherited are challenged and undone. So, Scott, I hope that sort of gives a quick enough, but hopefully precise enough understanding of the criteria of critical diversity literacy.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Melissa. Now Nceba is going to take us through what we do in each of the chapters of the book.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you, Scott. In the chapters of the book, the first chapter is sort of like grounded in our firm belief that organizations are actually microcosm. They're a microcosm of the broader society, and that there's a reciprocal relationship between the organization and society in as far as the production and reproduction and entrenchment of oppression and equality is concerned. So we do argue then in the first chapter that challenging and changing these patterns of oppression and marginality does require leadership. So we dedicate this chapter then in kind of like unpacking how we see leadership. Firstly, we talk about the challenges that are facing leaders on a global scale. We focus more specifically on the 4 challenges, being the environmental sustainability, which we all know about. We focus on the technological advancement that are happening rapidly, particularly in the COVID/post-COVID context, but most importantly, which is our sharp focus here, is the challenges that are confronted by leadership in terms of the growing inequalities as well as the challenges that are presented by the growing diverse workforce and diversity in society at large. So we argue that more often than not, people think of leadership in as far as addressing these issues as kind of like a hierarchical phenomenon. So there's kind of like this external locus of control. But we firmly believe that everybody is a leader and everybody has a responsibility in terms of taking leadership and taking this work forward. In chapter 2, we sort of like draw attention to sort of like the crises that are taking place within the organization. Certainly in the South African context, we've actually seen quite a lot of diversity-related dynamics play out. There's a lot of organizations where this is manifested overtly as well as covertly. And if we also look at the progress that the South African organizations more specifically have achieved over the last 20 years or so, we acknowledge the fact that there's been some progress post-1994, largely driven by the legislative instruments that have been enacted by the democratic government. And these relate to your employment equity, your broad-based economic empowerment legislation. But if we take a critical view of the progress that has been realized so far, we believe that it's actually been very slow in certain instances. In fact, the Commission for Employment Equity, we do provide some graphs in the book. The Commission for Employment Equity report, if you analyze it quite carefully, it shows that despite the fact that Black people in South Africa form about 91% of the economically active population, their representation at the senior as well as top management levels has actually been progressing at 1% per annum, which then gives you the sense that in order to fully transform those leadership roles that are associated with power, decision-making, and are linked to also social classes and statuses in society, it will take South Africa more than 90 years to actually transform those patterns. Similarly, if you look from a gender perspective, and you look at the economically active population from a gender perspective, we continue to have organizations that are male dominated. And we know that this actually links to exactly what Melissa was talking about from a patriarchal perspective. And this does filter through into the organizational culture. And the way in which these manifest, we unpack it in greater detail in the book. But more often than not, we see employee turnover, we see difficulties in attracting talent, we see difficulties in terms of the dynamics that actually play out in the workplace. And we also see difficulties in terms of fostering an inclusive organizational culture manifest in different ways. And the responses across different organizations has also differed quite a lot. And we are not convinced at this point in time that the responses are very effective, which is why in this book, we kind of like suggest that critical diversity literacy is one of the tools that are most powerful in terms and helpful in terms of addressing these issues. But we are also arguing that we can't run to solutions unless we are able to actually locate the present dynamics within the context of history. Melissa has actually touched base on this to a large extent. We think it's very important to kind of like take the reader through the history of modernity and how that project is sort of like is entangled with all these intersecting systems of dominance and oppression, capitalism, racism, ableism, patriarchy, and all of this kind of like become this concoction of intersecting systems of power, dominance, and oppression that then shape the reality that we have to deal with today. And in the South African context, more specifically, I think everybody is aware of our history of apartheid, which only ended very, very, very most recently, which is in 1994. And we do not believe that democracy in 1994 made these things evaporate. In actual fact, what we are still dealing with today is the effects of those years and years and years and years of oppression. I'm trying to, sorry, I'm cognizant of time, so I'm trying to go pretty swiftly. We see those effects in terms of the division of labor within the South African context. And I think most importantly, we also locate the organization or the corporate within the arrival of the Dutch East India Company within the South African context. And then we kind of like take everybody through that journey of how that has shaped the dynamics, the labor dynamics within the South African context. We then move into unpacking the responses that organizations have been using, or the tools or the models that organizations have been using to respond to these dynamics. And most importantly, realize that there's been quite a lot of drawing from the developments in the United States of America, as well as Europe, particularly around the affirmative action as sort of like a civil rights phenomenon, but how that has gotten hijacked over time and diluted to lose its original purpose of driving social justice, and it kind of like gets diluted into neoliberal affirming diversity sort of like model that kind of like preaches appreciation of a melting pot of differences without necessarily tackling the issues of inequality, like the real issues that Melissa was talking about. And this model evolves into multiculturalism and diversity management. I mean, it's very interesting studies that actually show that the investment that is put by organizations on diversity management has very, very, very minimal return on investment and real impact in terms of organizational change. At a personal level, we sort of like unpack the psychosocial paradigm and some of the models that emanate from that. And now with the workforce becoming more diverse from an age perspective, we do see some models which we unpack around the socialization hypothesis and how the multi-generational dynamics play out in the workplace. And then we see how that then evolves into the inclusion model as well as a corporate social responsibility model. In the next chapter, after unpacking these and critiquing these, we actually provide an alternative, which Melissa has eloquently articulated, which is the critical diversity literacy. And we unpack in greater detail the 10 principles of critical diversity literacy, which I won't go through because Melissa has already done that. And then we progress to chapter 6, where we talk about the role of management in terms of driving the change. And we firmly believe that unless management owns this work will not necessarily progress. This work is not going to move forward. And we do know, which we unpack in chapter 8, that it's not easy, it's always difficult. There's always forms of resistances that kind of like play out and manifest in the workplace to the change. And in chapter 9, we sort of like provide some tangible proposals around how to design and lead the change that is desired. I don't know if Melissa and Scott, you want to add anything?
No, that was really great. Thanks. We are keeping an eye on time. Maybe we can, in the later chapters in Q&A, see if there are questions about them. Thank you, Nceba. So we just want to do finally, before we go to Q&A, just connect some of these ideas to the current moment that we're living through, that we're all familiar with. So the first item, of course, is that we're in the middle of a culture war, which, Melissa, you wanted to talk a bit about what that means for our work now. And you're still muted.
Sorry about that. I think we're living through a moment where the contestations around what society should look like and about who should score, as it were, from the way in which society's organized has become very, very visible. And I think we need to understand this in the context. Well, let me first say what is really very visible is the rise of a right-wing movement and sentiment across the globe that honestly is trying, I like to say, make the world gross again. It's sort of like wanting to turn back and rewind the world to a time before we had all these many advances around questions of equality, around questions of diversity, around social organization. So I'm thinking from about probably around the mid 1900s, where we've had the decolonization processes, we've had various social rights movements, the civil rights movement, workers' rights movements, feminist women's movements, disability studies, disability rights movements, queer rights movements. All of these have grown, and we've also had, as my languaging has indicated, the growth of a rights culture, the sense that, all human beings should be entitled to the same basic human rights, and how these should play out in people's lived experiences. And so what we are seeing is that these right-wing movements are not arising sort of virginally out of thin air. There absolutely are backlash arising as forms of contestation to try to turn back those gains to a position where the old hierarchies and the old systems of inclusion and exclusion would be put back in place. So for me, the work that we do here is just so critically important, because we absolutely cannot lose the ground that we have gained. And we are facing a real crisis around, are we going to be able to hold on to the ground we've gained? Are we going to continue to push it? I myself believe that we will not actually. Long term, we will not lose these culture wars, but we could be in for a very turbulent time. And it's all going to depend on how much do we take this really seriously, and how cognizant and mindful and diligent we are in taking on the challenges.
But there's been a lot of talk recently about like there's like a diversity industry, that like everyone's selling a book on diversity. So people are saying we must move beyond diversity, equity, and inclusion, the DEI model. What's your perspective on that?
Thank you, Scott. So I actually think the last two chapters of this book are actually so helpful in terms of addressing that question. So what we are seeing in the industry is a lot of, excuse my language, but I'm going to call it sort of like vanilla solutions to the real problem. It's kind of like the solutions that continue to kind of like wrap the bandage on sort of like on wounds that are left unattended to, that they're not confronted, they're not named, and tough conversations are not actually being held. I like what we say in the book, where we're actually saying part of the work that needs to happen is to develop a muscle to move towards the discomfort zone, where we are not all comfortable with being comfortable because our comfort is at the expense of somebody else that is living with or silenced and living with that discomfort. So there is a professor that actually articulates this very well, who says that most of these solutions kind of like follow a Noah's Ark approach, which is just bring on board a pair of each kind and just hope that everything will actually be fine. But nobody gives an account of what happened to the relationship between the goat and the lion. And these are the conversations that we now need to dig deeper and actually have and run away from these sort of like platitudes and plastering over things and just hoping that we will all hold hands and be. We need to start developing a language to call out these systems of oppression. We must talk about white supremacy. How does it manifest in the workplace? What is it? Let's talk about ableism. What is ableism? What does it mean? And how does it manifest within our own organizations? Let's actually talk about heteropatriarchy. What is that? How does it manifest within our organizations? And once we are empowered with that literacy, with that ability to read these things, as well as the languaging to articulate these things, let's be critical about how our policies looking like, how our practices looking like, and how's the organizational culture looking like. And I think if we are able to do these things in a way that does not take them out of the history, but confront how history shapes today, I think we will actually be on the right path towards having much more impactful diversity and inclusion models. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nceba. My final point was just to say that so much of what's going on right now is also challenging people to stop thinking in the old kind of psychological model of, racism is just in your head, it's just your prejudice, maybe you have an unconscious bias, it's just because we have these kind of cultural models of, men and women or whatever, we just need to somehow change the picture in our head. It's fundamentally shifting in the discourse at the moment to people starting hopefully to understand, in order to change, that what we need is an analysis of the system as a whole and the way that it's grounded in material inequality, that these things are not just prejudices in our heads, they are the ways that the world is organized. And it's only if those organizational forms and it's only if those material relations change that we're actually going to see any real progress happening. So the diversity mustn't be a story about, a prejudice in my head and, being nice or nasty to people. That's not where we're at. We're at a fundamental restructuring of our societies, and we have to remain focused on that. So that's my parting shot before we go to the Q&A. Patricia, I'm sure you would like to get to manage that, so thank you. You're muted.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Nceba. It was a really great presentation. I have left the link to a bookstore as well as 25% coupon code you can use to get the book if you're interested. And now we can start with the Q&A time. Please, if you want to contribute with a question or a comment, please click the raise your hand button on Zoom, or you can also write your question in the chat. If you prefer not to, I can read the question, or you can do it if you prefer. If you have a question, you can also turn off your camera.
Yes, good morning or good evening.
Evening.
A brief question. Are there any insights as far as moving forward from today regarding diversity, inclusion, and equity? So again, a forward-looking type of scenario. Any insights there would be very good.
Sorry, Dr. Daly. Thank you for that. You know, I'm not quite sure I understand. Do you mean specifically in terms of our process of taking this forward, or do you mean sort of at a global, sort of macro level of taking diversity forward?
Well, yes, macro level would be very good.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
So I'm sure my colleagues will have other insight. But quite honestly, for me, it really is. We talk about culture wars. I mean, it really is about struggle, and it is about refusing to allow status quo systems of oppression to remain unchallenged and to just simply reproduce themselves. So I'm afraid the way forward is tough, and it requires vigilance and energy from all of us who are committed towards creating fairer and more equitable societies. I don't think that there's any other quick fix. We've got to see this as a project, because you can be absolutely certain that the right sees this as a project. You know, I'm not saying necessarily consciously, but it's something people are committed to and are working on at all sorts of different levels, whether it's in terms of knowledge formation, whether it's in terms of organizational politics, whether it's in terms of school practices. People are working at this as a social labor. And we have to understand that this is what it is. And we have to not be found wanting in terms of doing the labor towards pushing the boundaries and not allowing the ground that we've gained to be eroded.
I think, Nceba, you have also something to say about this?
Thank you.
Yeah, I think so. I think, Melissa, I mean, you've summed it up so well. I just wanted to add that I do think that organizations have a massive window of opportunity with the current shift towards shifting the organizational perspective from sort of like this stake from the shareholder capitalism model, where organizations were always seen as only the phenomena of the markets and only accountable to shareholders for the bottom line. We're actually seeing quite a huge movement around the location of organizations within society and having to respond to global issues, societal issues, etc., and being held accountable for that. I think that this is an opportunity that all organizations should maximize to drive exactly the kind of change that Melissa was talking about. And we need to be intentional about it. And I do know that it goes broader than the organizations, but I'm actually bringing it into the organizational context as well as the individual level, as we have articulated the fact that as leaders, we all have a role to play.
Thank you, Nceba. Ariel has left a comment on, I think, Edward, you prefer to say something first? We have some comments on the chat. Ariel left one comment. Do you prefer to read it, or you want me to do it, Ariel?
I just wanted to say thank you. I see what you're describing very similar to kind of the public health arc in that it took us a long time to move away from personal health only to kind of the systemic roots of health. And we found that that was much greater influence on the health of an individual and the health of communities. And so I see the work that we're doing here very similar, and we still have a long way to go in public health. And we're very similarly have a long way to go here in differences in the workplace. But that arc that you described was so great. So thank you.
Thank you. That's such an important insight also, because we live so often in societies that are trying to atomize us, trying to make things our fault. And, you know, so this whole thing that, you know, you are responsible for your health, and, you know, you have to eat, you know, this, and you have to do that, and you know, etc. And so we lose sight of these very important ways in which our well-being is social, and how, you know, that we're not these atomistic individuals of neoliberal capitalism, that we're actually in communities. And so thank you very much. That's a great insight, Ariel.
Next question is from Pierre Leitner. I'm not sure, do you prefer to see it yourself, or should I read it?
I can certainly do that. I just, in any case, my question is about language, more concretely, more specifically, and the importance of saving, if you want, languages that have been repressed. Certainly in Canada now we have. This is a growing importance to have all the indigenous languages that have been repressed over the last century be reintegrated into our signs, into our awareness. So maybe if you could expand a bit more on language and speech and in this process.
I'm happy to say something if you want me to. I'm happy to jump in. Yes, thank you very much, Pierre. You know, in the very broadest sense, you could regard what we're doing with critical diversity literacy as part of the decolonizing project. I'll call it that, call it also a project. It isn't completely seamlessly linked to the decolonization theory, and I could explain to you why I say that. But it is part of the general, the spirit of our times towards decolonizing the world and decolonizing our minds. And so I think, you know, around the question of languages, you're absolutely right. It's a question about how do we make visible the norms that are so powerful that they want us to believe that they're just natural and normal, or just simply, you know, obvious and obviously the best for all of us. And so, you know, I feel quite strongly like, for example, the hegemony of English is something that we need to challenge, you know, because like in our country, we're only now beginning to have students in our university system who are writing their theses in their own home languages, only now, you know, but English is held out as being the language that you know, it's global. So obviously this is the language we should all be using. And, you know, you won't have any opportunities if you can't speak English. And unfortunately, there's a lot of truth in that because it is so hegemonic and so globally powerful. But I think that part of the work of what we're doing is to ask, you know, how are these operations of power? How are they the expressions of a completely gross unequal power relations that operate globally, and how do we challenge those? And I think a very important part of that is to refuse to allow languages that are more local, that arise out of communities that are less powerful. How do we ensure that they aren't allowed to just simply die? So, and maybe not everybody would agree with me, but I would say that that is an important part of what we have to do.
Thank you.
I think we have time for last question. There is left in the chat. Do you prefer to read it or should I do it?
I can read it. I was just curious about the fact, and by the way, thank you so much for this session. It's really helpful for me. When working in a global context and you have the role of diversity and inclusion, but then sometimes you feel like you're really fighting the laws and cultures of different countries when trying to push their diversity and inclusion agenda. So I'm really curious, what can we do? Because sometimes I feel stuck. I don't know what to do. I can't fight the laws. Culture is very important. People have different religions and values. So what do we do as an organization to be able to be at the same place, at the same space as an organization? Or is this important at all? Or should I just stop and say every organization, every country to have their own kind of rules? I'm just curious about that. Please help.
Scott, I think you come in. I don't want to hog the.
Nceba unmuted. So Nceba, you go first. You.
All right. Look, Scott, that is such an interesting question, and I can certainly draw from my own personal experiences as the leader of transformation in a company that's kind of like been represented in multiple countries. I think that the first mistake we made in most instances was to kind of like take the culture of our organization in our country as is and make it an organizational, I'm saying the organizational culture of our country and kind of like impose it on the different other contexts in which we were operating in. We actually found that there's value in immersing yourself in understanding the context, the culture, the languages, etc., and actually work with and from within, as opposed to kind of like juxtaposing the culture of the different context with what the organization has defined as the culture. So that inflexibility does not help. Scott, over to you.
I was going to make a sort of a quite general point, Liz, about the way sort of the history of some organizations that, we often think, and a part of like our presentation was implying that the organizations are generally kind of behind some kind of social change, that they're sort of lagging behind and that society is maybe a little bit ahead. And then it's like trying to get the organization to catch up. There are also many cases where organizations are sort of ahead of society, where organizations become themselves leaders in a particular area, whether it's in I don't know, let's just say, for example, parental leave. An organization has policies that secure rights for mothers and fathers, or mothers and mothers, or fathers and fathers, to have a decent amount of time off to take care of their newborn babies, for example, and that go far ahead what the national culture says, go far ahead what is required by law. So certainly it is possible that an organization can develop an internal culture that is even more progressive than the law, etc., allows for. At the same time, of course, that it puts the pressure back on that question of the internal culture and the leadership within that internal culture, and the importance of leaders and the conversation, of course, understanding we're not only talking about hierarchical management here, but that we're talking about changing the internal feeling of an organization as members of a team. And, it sounds to me like you're really frustrated with the kind of the environment that you're in, and that it's very hard to change that. And, I think in instances like that, there is your own leadership and there is the leadership of your colleagues that you can rely on to change that culture. There are also, other institutional forms that you can find to impact on and to change. That we are in a number of organizations, all of us. We're not only workers, we're also in churches, we're also parts of community organizations, etc., where we can be part of some change. And these things happen slowly and organically, and they might take a long time to shift.
Liz, and if I can come in at a different angle, I'm not muted again. Hey, if I can come in at a different angle to complement what has been said, I think what we're witnessing in Iran is a very important sort of like case study lesson for us in terms of why I said earlier on that I actually do believe that long term, we're on the winning side of the struggle, because you can see there how the laws are trying to hold back changes that women are recognizing as their entitlement, their understanding that they are being held back from living the lives that they want to live, and that they are being oppressed. And so I think there's an ethos that has developed over the last 50 to 80 years or so that is not going to be rolled back. I think that you can see that the women themselves from within the country are taking up that struggle and moving forward with huge difficulty, and nobody can say that it's without a terrible price and that it's going to just be a linear progression. But ultimately, I feel convinced that this will win, and so I think with your speaking to the frustration of the tensions between laws and culture and religion is a big one. But I think that there's a way in which we make discourses available to people, we make understandings of their positions available to people, and very often that's what you need, is to understand that this is not inevitable. It doesn't have to be like this, and give a name to why you feel you are suffering. That's very empowering. And understanding the languaging of how the systems of oppression and domination are operating. And I think we can trust people within their own societies and within their own communities to be moving this what can I say? It's like a global mood that will take people forward. So I understand your frustration, but I think you've also got to trust people, that they will in the end move in this direction of greater freedom, greater dignity, greater recognition.
Thank you, Melissa. Well, unfortunately, we are a bit past the time, so we need to finish the presentation. But again, Melissa, Scott, thank you so much for being here today, as well as everyone else. Thank you to be here, attend, share the fantastic comments and questions that we have here today. So I hope you have a good day. Bye.
Thanks. Have a lovely weekend, everyone.
Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Thank you. Lovely conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.